Marques is a multimedia artist, independent scholar, traditional African cosmologist, co-founder of Rainbow Serpent, Inc. Presentation today is Ancient Egypt and the Art of Self-Becoming. Please help me welcome Dr. Marques.
Okay, so I want to begin today by extending my thanks to Mervat. We just met very recently, about 2 months ago, in a conference in Scotland about consciousness, and we were both on a panel exploring ancient Egyptian approaches to the subject. You generously invited me to come today, and I'm happy to be here, so thank you very much for this opportunity. So my name is Marques. The talk for today is entitled Ancient Egypt and the Art of Self-Becoming. So I will start by just giving a little bit of background about myself and some of the projects that I've worked on. So I, along with Michaela Wuna, am the co-founder and co-executive director of Rainbow Serpent. We're a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania-based nonprofit organization that works at the intersection of traditional African cosmologies, multimedia art, and emerging technologies. And so we've worked on a variety of projects together. In May of this year, we released a series of 16 glass sculptures called Mid-Science of the Gatekeepers. And here is, you can see an example of this alchemical hermetic statue making. So this is actually an image, a statue of myself in the form of Hapi, the androgynous deity of the Nile River. Another example from this series is Khonsu, a deity of the moon. And you can see the ancient Egyptian prototype on the left. We also, Michaela and I, produced a film called Black Star Sanctuary, which is really a virtual reality environment of an ancient Egyptian temple modeled on Philae. And we filmed an exploration of the space with megalithic versions of the statues we created, positioned in different symbolic places around the temple. We could think of it not only as a virtual reality space, but it's also a post-mortem afterlife space. It's also a vision of an idealized state. All of those things happening multidimensionally at once. We also, turning to a West African Igbo Nigerian tradition, we created a film called The Primordial House, which presents a myth about the creation of the world through these two androgynous deities who caused the world to emerge through a process of dance. The sequel to this project was a live performance called The Four World Ages, which is exploring a particular West African myth about the unfolding of human history through 4 eras, starting with an age of divine unity and ending in our current age of chaos. So this project was also a photography series, and you have these 4 figures here that are witnessing the cyclical return of a new age of divine unity. Another example from this photography series with pre-colonial Igbo glyphs called Nsibidi that are adorning the set. We've also done public art projects. This was a 1,200 square foot billboard called Playing the Cosmic Strings, again exploring Igbo ideas about the creation of music for the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. And we also think about how to embody these different traditions through retreats that we offer at spiritual centers like Esalen. This one was called Harnessing the Power of Creation Through African Ritual. Okay, so for today, though, I'm going backwards in historical time, and we'll be giving a talk about the Book of Knowing, the Evolutions of Ra, and Overthrowing Apep. So the idea here really is that I want to provide a philosophical exploration of some of the ancient Egyptian motifs that really are at the core of the later Hermetic tradition. We don't know exactly when this text was written. I've seen some speculation that it comes from 2500 BC, which would make it one of the oldest, if not the oldest, map of creation, a creation narrative that we get in human history. And as such, I think of it as an original and originating narrative of origins. Original in the sense because there really is no other text quite like it. We get the narrative of the universe speaking about their origins, and I'm using their very specifically, in their own words and voice. So what we're getting is the universe saying, I'm going to tell you who I am and how I emerge. It's quite a beautiful text, full of an aesthetic splendor, a cognitive complexity, and a spiritual depth that I hope to at least give you an introduction to. And so when we hear this voice, we get a vision of this alive cosmos, this universe that is organic, that is it is unfolding, it's conscious, and the self-consciousness of the universe is the actual catalyst that gives rise to everything else. So what you get here is really a super story. It's kind of the story of all stories. I mean, it's the story that gives rise to all stories. It's the story, really the most important story, because it's the moment where the universe is able to articulate how it itself develops. And I know this is a bit of hyperbole, but I want to at least offer it as a bit of tantalizing thought, particularly in conversation with the previous panel, that this text we could possibly think of as a unified theory of all theories, sciences, art, and gnosis. So I'll read a little bit of the text just for so I'm sure many people are not familiar with it. I do have on my Egyptian costume as well, so I can do the performative piece that we've seen in some earlier presentations. Okay, and it's a little long, so I'll kind of do a few extracts toward the end. But we have the book of knowing the evolutions of Ra and overthrowing Apep, the words of Nebuchadnezzar, which he spoke after he had come into being. I am he who came into being in the form of Khepera. And keep an eye on this glyph of the scarab beetle, the dung beetle, and you'll see how it repeats throughout. So I was the creator of what came into being, the creator of all what came into being. After my coming into being, many were the things which came into being coming forth from my mouth. Not existed heaven, not existed earth, not had been created the things of the earth, and creeping things in that place. I raised them up from out of new, the primeval abyss of water, from a state of inactivity. Not found I a place I could stand wherein. I worked a charm upon my heart. I laid a foundation in Ma'ah, and I made every attribute. I was alone, for not had I spit in the form of Shu, not had I emitted Tefnut, not existed another who worked with me. I made a foundation in my own heart, and there came into being the multitude of things which came into being, of the things which came into being, from out of the things which came into being of births, from out of the things which came into being of their births. I, even I, had union with my clenched hand. I joined myself in an embrace with my shadow. I poured seed into my own mouth. I sent forth issue in the form of Shu. I sent forth moisture in the form of Tefnut. Okay, so just to skip down a little bit to the end of the page, I became from God one, God's three. That is, from out of myself, and after I came into being in this earth. Were raised up, therefore, Shu and Tefnut in the inert watery mass wherein they were. Brought they to me my eye in their train. After, therefore, I had united my members, I wept over them, and came into being men and women from the tears which came forth from my eye. I'm skipping down a little bit. Let's go down to the end of this slide. I came forth from, or in the plants, the form of, all creeping things, and things which came into being, all in them. Give birth Shu and Tefnut, get Geb and Nut. Give birth Geb and Nut to Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, Nephthys from the womb. One after the other of them, they give birth, and they multiply in this earth. Okay, so I know that was a lot. That's a lot to unpack here. But this was not the only version of this text, because the text itself is also participating in this process of becoming and emanated multiple versions of itself throughout time. So there's also a version B of this text, on which I'll just add one or two extra things for us to consider. So I brought into my mouth my own name, that is to say, a word of power. And I, even I, came into being in the form of things which came into being, and I came into being in the forms of Khepera. I came into being from the primeval matter. Okay, and finally, they invoke my name, they overthrow their enemies, they create words of power for the overthrow of Apep. Okay, so that's the foundational text that we'll be working with over the next 20 or so minutes. But first, to begin, I think we have to understand hieroglyphic language to even understand the philosophical intervention that's happening in this text. And this is a great follow-up to the last presentation because it's a language that is really filled with multiple layers. Things are happening multidimensionally at the same time. There's a lot of symbolic density. So in each glyph is a real icon of cosmic and cultural power. We could spend a lot of time focusing on just one singular glyph and all of the temporal levels of meaning that are embedded in it. But it's also another level of meaning when you think about how each symbol then provides nuance and different shadings of meanings to all the symbols that are around it. And each symbol is also bringing in loads of information from the outside natural and cultural worlds, and also from different historical eras, both in the past and in the future. We get an integration of form and meaning. So we're using both halves of our brain because each glyph has pictorial and textual elements working in tandem. So we're getting a sense where there's no separation from the experience and the experiencer and the experienced, because all of these different levels are working together and we're having to activate different parts of our consciousness to even understand the language. And also the language can be written in multiple directions. So depending on how they're presented, hieroglyphs can be read from right to left to right, or from top to bottom. And each of those arrangements are also expanding our perceptual apparatus in new ways, and it's also helping us think beyond certain forms of linear time, because again, the hieroglyphs are working multidimensionally. And this idea of deep archetypal imagery, we've heard a lot about Jung over the course of the conference, and some of the images are actually tapping into some of the fundamental root experiences of humanity as a species, really. And some of those early moments from deep time, those moments from the formation of the collective unconscious, are still resonating through these glyphs. Okay, so let's start with the text, because the text starts actually not at the beginning, but before the beginning, and speculating metaphysically about what actually preceded the beginning of creation. And this really connects with a lot that we heard from Aaron's talk. There's this state that I call the primordial androgynous blackness. And so this is before the universe becomes aware of itself. In all of these interesting syntactical phrases, not existed heaven, not existed earth, not found I a place I could stand therein. So you get this sense of this homogeneous, infinite, unlimited kind of existence that happens before creation. What we could think of as a transmutative ether of sorts that then morphs itself into all of the forms of the material invisible world. So you have this kind of primordial substance that is all pervasive in and as the universe. And we can call this a nothingness, that is a fullness, that is a sense of all potential that still keeps and retains a marker in everything that exists. So it's the kind of nothingness that's still present in everything. So you're really getting a very complex kind of metaphysical speculation right from the beginning of the text. And so from the first line, we're getting the sense, like I said earlier, of the universe as a vital, animated, living kind of being. So I am he who came, and so we should even talk about verb phrases, because really there's a deconstruction of verb tense that's happening here. So it really is I am he who came, is coming, and will come into being all at the same time. Because again, it's a sense that creation is not over, that the universe is still creating now, and that the emergence from this primordial source will continue happening in the future. So I am he who came into being in the form of Kepera. I was, became, and becoming the creator of what has come, is coming, and will come into being, the creator of all that's coming into being in all time dimensions. And it's also deconstructing the individual self, because when you're reading the text, you're actually activating the text and speaking in the voice of the text. So you're saying, I, Marques, actually am the one who is coming into being in the form of Kepera. So again, we get a sense that we have to live into the text, grow into the text. The text is, in some sense, calling us from the future so that we can be initiated to understand and actually speak the words of the text. So there are all of these really complex presence effects that are happening even from just the beginning of the monologue. So I will talk a little bit about this figure of Kepera, the sacred dung beetle, the scarab beetle, that is used as the sign of creative evolution. So the question becomes, why a dung beetle? Why this small little thing, which I actually saw last night at the performance, which I thought was a good omen. But I would say several things. So on one hand, the dung beetle provides a very important ecological function, collecting dung from larger animals, rolling it into balls, and planting its eggs in there. So when the larvae of the beetle is born, it already has an automatic food source. So one idea here is that life can emerge even from the most abject of material. Even what we think of as waste material can still generate new life. Ancient Egyptians saw these little insects rolling and pushing these balls across different landscapes. And so that was analogized to this idea of the sun rolling across the sky. So in the sense of becoming, we're also getting this idea of a cycle of day going into night, coming back into day. You're getting a cycle of life, going into death, and coming back to life through the rolling of this ball. And jumping forward in historical time, the beetle is also the sign that comes up again in a scientific context when we get something like the Mandelbrot fractal, which is, if you're familiar with this image, is also in the form of a beetle. And the interesting thing about this image is that regardless of how much you zoom into it, it retains its shape. So the same beetle shape repeats on all levels of zooming. You can pull out of it and the beetle shape will remain. So there are many ways you could read this text. So you could read it as I am he who came into being in the form of fractals, thinking about the kinds of fractal connections that the universe gives rise to. We could think of I am he who came into being in the form of insects who plant their eggs in dung. I am he who came into being in the form of the cycle of day and night that will continue repeating. So you have to hear all of those meanings as you're reading the text. Okay, let me try to keep going. But either way, so you get this idea of an active unity between the creator, the creation, and the act of creation. So you get this holistic kind of worldview that's kind of put into place really very early in the development of ancient Egyptian culture. Okay, so from there, the text wants to give us a map to understand how do we get from this cosmic scale down to our human dimension. So we start with this idea, I poured seed into my mouth, I send forth issue in the form of shu, moisture in the form of tefnut. So shu and tefnut are usually thought of as, shu is air, tefnut is moisture, but more broadly we could think of them almost as a yin and yang kind of concept, where one represents more expansive forces, one more contractive forces. There's a lot to say here, but there's really a whole philosophy of polyrhythmicity that you can unfold from this text, and about the way in which creation is set in motion through the tensions and dualities that are embedded as part of reality. Okay, so shu and tefnut, and again, I'm just going very quickly just to kind of stay within the time, but happy to elaborate any of these ideas. So shu and tefnut were raised up in the inert mass wherein they were. They brought to me my eye. Therefore, after I had united my members, I wept over them, and men and women came into being from the tears which came forth from my eye. So on one hand, you're getting a little bit of wordplay here. So the word for men and women is very similar to the word for tears. So that sound connection is what's helping to generate this part of the text. So shu and tefnut bring the I. Many things happening there. So on one hand, the I is self-awareness, and the self-awareness of the universe that will then propel is a further catalyst of action. But the I here is also the sun. And thinking about the tears being the rays of the sun and how solar energy provides the foundation for all of life on Earth. So we're getting mythical meanings and scientific meanings, again, fused together in one. A lot happening here. So on one hand, we get this mirroring of the human and divine self because humanity is made of the same substance as the divine. I mean, we're literally the tears of the divine, so there's no distinction between the human and divine substance. We have this idea that the universe itself has an emotion. Because the universe is crying, this could be tears of joy, this could be tears of sorrow. And we could even think about, let's say, a methodology like astrology as being a mode of thinking that is trying to tell us the mood of the universe, the emotion of the universe. How is the universe feeling at a particular time? And of course, there are many different kinds of ethical and aesthetic implications of this. On one hand, we get this foundational Hermetic idea about the unity of all beings because we're all connected to this divine substance of the tears that are coming from the Creator. And in some respect, human beings are created for the Creator to experience creation from within creation, so we can participate in the same kind of divine sorrow, divine joy that the whole universe is participating in. Okay, so from here, we get a genealogy. So from shu and tefnut, many other levels then kind of emerge. And what I would argue here is that you're getting both an allegory of the unfolding of human faculties and the unfolding of divine faculties. Because again, the human and the divine are mirrored. So the same kind of matrix of deities or kind of deific energies that are creating a vehicle for the material world to emerge are the same kinds of faculties that are present in the human psyche. And so you get this unfolding from Nebuchadnezzar to Shu and Tefnut, from Shu and Tefnut to Geb and Nut, and then from Geb and Nut to Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set. So you'll already see here 10 figures that are organized really in a family tree. I mean, and it really is a genealogical story that unfolds. So with this 10, one could see a precursor to Pythagorean forms of speculation, to Kabbalistic forms of speculation, because here really is the actual tree of life. I mean, here's a tree that provides the foundation for the emergence of the universe. Okay, so we start with Shu and Tefnut, which is the expansive and contractive energy. From there, we go to Geb and Nut. Again, Egyptologically, they're thought of usually as the earth deity and the sky deity, but more symbolically, Geb will be the phenomenal realm, the realm of visible things, material icons and objects, whereas Nut would be more of a metaphysical realm, the sky, the heaven. So this would be the place where the deities live, where the ancestors live, where the creation, the imaginal realm, if you will, to use the Henry Corbin language. Okay, so from Geb and Nut, we get the 5 here. And if you know the stories and the myths of Egyptian history, these figures are probably familiar to you and will help you kind of understand the allegorical work that's happening. But either way, just a quick summary. Osiris was the king of Egypt, representing the faculties of wisdom and spiritual power, was killed by Set, the separative intellect, who hacks him into multiple pieces, who is reconstructed by Isis and Nephthys, this idea about being devoted to becoming and to reconstructing the divine self. And Horus, this faculty of divine law and the will, becomes the new reigning king. So either way, so these become a system theory of sorts, and this becomes a matrix of metaphysical forces that provide the context for every kind of physical object or event. And again, these are divine faculties that the divine emerges out of itself so that the world can be created. And these are the faculties that we find within the human self. We could also think of this tree, this allegory, as a narrative also about the unfolding of the material world. So not just divine faculties, but how do we actually get creation from the most abstract to the present? So again, thinking about these same figures differently, we have Shu and Tefnut as dark energy and dark matter, and the interplay between them. Coming down to Geb, the deity of the earth, we could think of Geb as a symbol of the hydrosphere and lithosphere, Nut as the atmosphere that covers and gives rise to life on the planet. And then we could think of these last 5 figures as figures of the biosphere. So let's say Set being a symbol of ecological change, Osiris being a sense of seasonal growth and decay that all living things go through, Isis being the kind of protective forces within nature, etc. Okay, so we are at a conference called Ancient Wisdom, Future Self. And so we could also use this cycle of 10 to also think about an allegory of theories of the self. I mean, so again, the way in which cosmology functions is that it's a map that really provides answers for how order comes out of chaos. And again, it's a map that functions on many different levels simultaneously. So we're also getting an understanding of how to theorize about this large self that's emerging and becoming. And I won't go through all of this right now, but we could think about, let's say from the perspective of Geb, the earth deity, the self would be a sensory-based phenomenon that's grounded, almost like your basic materialist kind of thinking, where the self is just grounded in the physical body, the brain, the empirical world, etc. But each deity gives you a different lens through which to understand the phenomenon of the self. Okay, so just a few more themes that I want to highlight before closing. And again, setting the stage for further developments that we see in Hermetic traditions. So there's this idea about the word, the living word as a creative force. And there are, again, multiple different ways in which this idea manifests. So we have this statement, the words of Nebuchadnezzar, which he spoke after he came into being. So we've already talked about the cosmological word. So the way in which divine utterance becomes the structuring force that helps the cosmos come into existence. But we could also think about this, let's say, from a genetic perspective. So we have this idea about DNA, which at its core is really a series of letters, A, T, C, and G. And so just like the genetic word dictates a certain kind of form and function of organisms, we have this text as a speculation. We could read it from the perspective of genetics. So the words of Nebuchadnezzar being the actual words of DNA that are coming into existence and giving rise to organisms. Or if we think about it from a cultural perspective, we have the words of, let's say, divine law, the words of the myths, the words of the stories that we tell about our origins. And so those words are the structuring words that help organize the mores, the life paths of different cultures. So when we're saying the words are coming into existence, the words that he's speaking, the words are happening on all of these levels: psychic, spiritual, the breath of life, cosmological, all at once. Okay, so I brought into my mouth my own name. So here we can hear an early theorization about the power of mantras. I know there was some talk earlier about the chanting of vowels. So here we have very early on this theorization about the importance of words and the chanting of words for creating material reality. I mean, we can actually even see here an origin of cymatics, the way in which words actually create physical material realities. We could think about here, so I brought into my mouth my own name, a word of power, and then I came into being in the form of things which came into being. So the self itself is a vibrational phenomenon. And we could think about the self as having a frequency and a sound and a certain mode of existence. There's a power of naming. So in thinking about the ancient Egyptian understanding of the self, the name was one of the important spiritual bodies. And so the name is already being theorized here as an important part of self-definition, self-creation, and bringing a coherent self into existence. And of course, we can also see here a prefiguration of certain kinds of sound therapy. Again, thinking about how sound can be used to heal and to create other kinds of magic effects. Okay, so there's a piece around the origin of ritual and the arts here as well. So I had union with my clenched hand. I joined myself in an embrace with my shadow. I poured seed into my own mouth, and then I spit it out in the form of Shu and Tefnut. So I would contend that what we have here is an actual sex ritual. So we have a deity who creates the world through ejaculating into their own mouth. I will save some of the kinds of speculation that I do about this for a different kind of context, but I will say that this is a model for a certain kind of ritual practice. Is talking about the power of orgasm and eroticism and desire that's baked into the development of the universe right from the beginning. It is a map of producing and engaging in certain kinds of ritual. I'm sure the Crowleyans in the room will be very familiar with this kind of work. We have a sense, and when we participate in those rituals, we are kind of engaging in a procreative function, but also in a recreative function, because ritual is also recreating the origin, the primal origin and the primal ritual act that gave rise to creation in the beginning. We could also see it, the origin of arts here, through this kind of autogenic process that I join myself in an embrace. It will be interesting to think about in conversation with the Hermetic embrace. What does this autogenesis have to do to serve as the development of future kinds of arts and rituals? But you know, the cosmic word is not just written, but it's spoken, it's danced, it's sung, it's painted. And so here I join myself in an embrace. I mean, that's also a kind of a dance. That's a kind of theatrical performance. The kind of spitting out of the world in the form of semen is a kind of singing, and the kind of the singing of the world, the painting with this kind of fluid. So again, in a kernel form, you can see here the way in which ritual practice is being analyzed and thought about, art practice is being thought about. So we have this idea about the role of the priest as this cosmic intermediary. And there are all kinds of very complex recursive effects that are happening because we have this creator that creates the universe, but then needs the divinized human being in order to experience the creation from within the creation. So we have a creator who is narrating the story to say, I am the creator of all that came into being, while participating in the story. And the priest also is, interestingly enough, has to elevate their consciousness to be able to read nature, to be able to understand the emergence of nature in all of the natural forms, and to be able to be possessed by the creator, to be able to write the story of creation. And so there are many kinds of complicated things that are happening with how the text is being presented to us, the ontological status of this text, and again, the way in which this text is calling us to elevate our consciousness so we can write the text that has already been written. But when we write it, we will come to understand ourselves as the creator who's created the world for the purpose of understanding how it can be written as the creator, if that makes sense. Okay, so, and it's through knowing the story that we can defeat chaos, basically. So the serpent apep, which represents the uncontrolled reptilian part of the brain, is actually defeated through knowing the story of how human beings themselves are the creator, to create the story that tells the story of creation. So yeah, so that is it, but I will say I do have one quick 2-minute song version. So I know there was the talk about music earlier. So I did compose a song that sets this text to music, and I'll end by just playing a quick 2 minutes of that. Yeah, so performed by a friend of mine, Wesley Glenn. All right, thank you much.